The name Nasser El Sonbaty might not be as widely recognized as some bodybuilding legends, but to those who witnessed his prime, he was something extraordinary. A genetic anomaly wrapped in controversy, intelligence, and raw mass that seemed to defy the laws of nature. At his peak, Nasser stood as the most credible threat to Dorian's throne. Their rivalry wasn't just about muscles and conditioning. It represented a clash of philosophies, personalities, and approaches to the sport. Dorian, the quiet warrior who trained in solitude and let his physique do the talking. Nasser, the outspoken intellectual who never hesitated to call out what he saw as corruption and politics in the industry. But here's what makes this story even more compelling. Dorian Yates, now 63 years old, has finally started opening up. After years of keeping his thoughts private, he's begun sharing his perspective on that infamous night and the man who pushed him to his absolute limits. What he's revealing changes everything we thought we knew about their relationship. The respect he held for Nasser, the brutal reality of competing with a career-ending injury, the politics behind the scenes that neither competitor could control, and perhaps most shocking of all, whether he truly believed he deserved to win that final Olympia. This isn't just another bodybuilding rivalry story. This is about two men who sacrificed everything for their craft, a sport that chewed them up and spit them out, and a moment in time that continues to divide fans to this very day. One of these men went on to build a successful post-competitive career. The other spiraled into bitterness, health problems, and a tragically early grave. The paths they took after 1997 couldn't have been more different, and understanding why requires going back to the beginning. Back to how a soccer player from Germany became the most dangerous challenger the Shadow ever faced. Nasser El Sonbaty didn't grow up dreaming of becoming a bodybuilder. In the early 1980s, he was just another young athlete in Stuttgart, Germany, chasing a soccer ball across muddy fields. Standing at 6 feet tall with a naturally athletic build, he seemed destined for a conventional sports career. But everything changed in 1983, when a friend dragged him into a local gym. What Nasser discovered that day would alter the trajectory of his entire life. His body responded to weight training like nothing the sport had ever seen before. Within months, muscle was piling onto his frame at an alarming rate. This wasn't normal beginner gains. This was genetic lottery material. By the late 1980s, Nasser had completely transformed. The soccer player had become a mass monster, and word started spreading through the European bodybuilding circuit about this freakishly gifted newcomer. He wasn't just big though. What separated Nasser from other massive competitors was that he somehow maintained aesthetic lines and proportions even as his weight climbed higher and higher. His back development became legendary, a thick, detailed expanse of muscle that looked like it belonged on someone from a different species. His arms measured over 24 inches. His quads were so developed they seemed to have their own zip codes. Yet when he hit poses, everything flowed together in a way that defied logic for someone his size. The bodybuilding world got its first real glimpse of Nasser's potential in 1994, when he stepped onto the Mr. Olympia stage for the first time. 7th place might not sound impressive, but context matters. This was his debut at the sport's most prestigious event, and he was standing alongside legends who'd been competing for years. More importantly, he didn't look out of place. The judges noticed him. The other competitors noticed him. And Dorian Yates, who won his 3rd consecutive title that year, definitely noticed him. After the show, whispers began circulating backstage. A new threat had emerged, and he was only going to get better. The next 3 years proved those whispers correct. Nasser's ascent through the professional ranks was nothing short of meteoric. He placed 2nd at the 1995 Night of Champions. He dominated the 1996 San Jose Pro, destroying a stacked lineup. Each time he stepped on stage, he seemed to have added another 10 pounds of muscle without sacrificing condition. By 1997, Nasser was walking around at over 300 pounds in the off-season, a weight that seemed impossible for someone who still maintained a relatively tight waist and visible muscle separation. Fans and competitors alike started asking the same question. Had anyone ever combined this much mass with this level of detail before? Then came the life-changing moment. Joe Weider, the godfather of bodybuilding and the man who controlled the industry's biggest magazines and supplement companies, offered Nasser a contract. This wasn't just about money, though the financial security was significant. A wider contract meant magazine covers, supplement endorsements, global recognition, and legitimacy, in a sport where politics often mattered as much as physiques. Nasser had arrived. He was now being mentioned in the same breath as Dorian Yates, the seemingly unbeatable champion who'd ruled the Olympia stage since 1992. The stage was set for an inevitable collision between two men who represented everything the mass monster era embodied. But behind the scenes, tensions were already building that would explode into one of bodybuilding's most bitter controversies. 1996 was supposed to be Nasser's breakthrough year. He'd been preparing for months, adding even more size while tightening up his conditioning to challenge Dorian for the Olympia crown. But then the IFBB dropped a bombshell announcement that sent shockwaves through the entire sport. For the first time in its history, the Mr. Olympia would be drug tested. Competitors would have to submit to urinalysis, and anyone caught using banned substances would be disqualified immediately. The announcement created chaos. This was bodybuilding, a sport where everyone knew what was really going on behind the curtain, but nobody talked about it openly. Now suddenly, the organization was pretending to care about clean competition. The testing protocol focused primarily on diuretics, the drugs competitors used in the final days before a show to shed water weight and achieve that shrink-wrapped vascular look judges rewarded. Steroids and growth hormone weren't even part of the testing panel, which struck many as absurd. It was like testing Olympic sprinters for caffeine while ignoring everything else. Still, the rule was clear. Get caught with diuretics in your system, and you're out. Most competitors played it safe, adjusting their prep protocols to avoid detection. Nasser made a different choice. He gambled. Years later, in one of his brutally honest interviews, Nasser admitted exactly what happened. He'd calculated the odds and decided the IFBB was bluffing. They'd never tested before, so why would they actually follow through now? He used diuretics right up until the last possible moment, betting that the organization wouldn't have the guts to disqualify one of their rising stars at the sport's biggest event. He was wrong. The test came back positive, and just like that, Nasser El Sonbaty was pulled from the 1996 Mr. Olympia lineup. The news hit the bodybuilding community like a sledgehammer. One of the favorites to challenge Dorian had been eliminated before ever stepping on stage. What made the situation even more controversial was how selective the enforcement seemed. Other competitors that year looked suspiciously dry and vascular, suggesting diuretic use, yet somehow only a handful got caught. Nasser wasn't the only one disqualified, but he was certainly the highest profile casualty. The whole thing reeked of inconsistency and raised questions about who was really being protected. Was this about cleaning up the sport, or about controlling who won? Nasser certainly had his theories, and he wasn't shy about sharing them. The disqualification planted seeds of bitterness that would grow into full-blown paranoia about judging politics and corruption in the years to come. Dorian Yates won his 5th consecutive Olympia title that year with relative ease. Without Nasser in the lineup, the competition wasn't nearly as threatening. But everyone knew the real showdown had been postponed, not cancelled. Nasser would be back in 1997, and this time he'd play by whatever rules the IFBB wanted to enforce. The anticipation for their next meeting reached fever pitch throughout the following year. Fans debated endlessly about what would happen when these two mass monsters finally clashed without disqualifications or technicalities getting in the way. They were about to get their answer, but under circumstances nobody could have predicted. What happened next would cement 1997 as the most controversial year in Mr. Olympia history. 3 weeks before the 1997 Mr. Olympia, Dorian Yates was in his Temple of Iron, the legendary temple gym in Birmingham, England. He was executing a routine tricep workout, the kind of session he'd performed thousands of times throughout his career. 1 rep, 1 single movement. That's all it took to end an era. During a set of tricep extensions, Dorian felt something give way in his left arm. Not a minor twinge or a manageable strain. This was catastrophic. The pain was immediate and severe, but the visual was even worse. His tricep had essentially detached, creating a grotesque deformity that made his arm look like it belonged to someone else. The injury was so severe that Dorian couldn't even get proper medical imaging done in the United Kingdom. Think about that for a moment. This was one of the most advanced countries in the world, with top-tier medical facilities, yet their MRI machines literally couldn't accommodate Dorian's physique. His arms were too massive to fit into the standard scanning equipment. He had to fly to New York City to find a facility with machinery large enough to assess the damage properly. When the results came back, they confirmed what Dorian already knew deep down. His tricep was 90% torn. For any normal person, this would mean immediate surgery and months of recovery. For a professional bodybuilder 3 weeks away from defending his title, it should have meant withdrawal. But Dorian Yates wasn't wired like normal people. He'd built his entire legacy on pushing past limits that stopped everyone else. The nickname The Shadow came from his ability to disappear from the public eye, train in obscurity, then emerge at the Olympia more massive and conditioned than anyone thought possible. Quitting wasn't in his vocabulary, even when his body was screaming at him to stop. He made a decision that would define the rest of his career and spark controversy that persists to this day. He would compete anyway. Injured, compromised, unable to train his upper body properly for the final crucial weeks of prep. He'd step on that stage and defend his title one last time. The weeks leading up to the show were brutal. Dorian couldn't perform most of his usual arm and shoulder exercises. Every movement sent shooting pain through the damaged tissue. His left tricep, once a perfectly developed horseshoe of muscle, now looked flat and underdeveloped compared to his right arm. The symmetry that judges valued so highly was gone. He tried to compensate by adjusting his posing, angling his body to minimize how obvious the injury looked under the lights. But there was only so much hiding he could do. When you're standing next to freaks like Nasser El Sonbaty under stage lighting, every imperfection gets magnified tenfold. Meanwhile, Nasser was coming into the show in absolutely ridiculous condition. After the humiliation of 1996, he'd spent an entire year preparing for this moment. His size was unreal. pushing 300 pounds on stage with the kind of muscle density and separation that shouldn't exist at that body weight. His back, already legendary, looked like a relief map of pure muscle fiber. His legs were massive tree trunks with striations visible from the cheap seats. And most importantly, he was healthy, uninjured, and hungry to prove he was the best bodybuilder on the planet. Every objective observer could see what was about to happen. This was Nasser's year. The crown was finally within reach. But bodybuilding has never been just about who brings the best physique. Politics, reputation, and subjective judging criteria all play roles that fans and competitors alike find frustrating. Dorian had won 5 straight Olympias. He was the face of the sport, the champion everyone associated with the mass monster era. The IFBB had invested heavily in his image. Would they really strip the title away from their golden boy, especially in what everyone suspected would be his final competition? The stage was set for a showdown that would divide the bodybuilding world for decades. September 20th, 1997, the Civic Auditorium in Pasadena, California. When the prejudging began that Saturday morning, the bodybuilding world was about to witness something unprecedented. As the competitors lined up for the first comparison, the contrast between Dorian and Nasser was striking. Nasser looked like he'd been carved from granite by an artist who didn't know when to stop. Every muscle group was full, separated, and conditioned to an extreme degree. His posing was confident, almost aggressive, as if he knew this was finally his moment. Dorian, meanwhile, was doing everything possible to hide the damage to his left arm, adjusting angles and using strategic poses to minimize the obvious asymmetry. The mandatory poses told the story. From the back, Nasser was untouchable. His lat spread created a width that seemed to extend beyond the boundaries of human anatomy. The Christmas tree definition in his lower back was so detailed it looked three-dimensional. His hamstrings were striated, his glutes were shredded, and his overall back development made even Dorian's legendary back look merely great instead of extraordinary. When they hit front double biceps, the difference in arm development was impossible to ignore. Dorian's injured left tricep created an obvious imbalance that no amount of posing tricks could fully conceal. Nasser's arms, meanwhile, were perfectly symmetrical cannons of muscle, but here's where things got complicated. Dorian still had certain advantages. His chest was thicker and more developed. His shoulder width and overall frame structure gave him a presence that commanded attention. And perhaps most importantly, he had the conditioning in his midsection that judges obsessed over. His abs were visible, his obliques were tight, and his waist, though not small, was under control. Nasser, despite being in phenomenal shape, had a slightly thicker midsection that some judges penalized. In a sport where a quarter inch of waist thickness can determine placings, this detail mattered more than it should have. The evening show brought even more drama. When the final call-outs happened, both men knew the decision was going to be razor thin. The audience was electric with tension. Hardcore fans were screaming support for both competitors, but there was a growing sense that something wasn't right. Veteran bodybuilders sitting in the audience, people who'd competed at the highest levels themselves, were looking at each other with confusion. Jay Cutler, who would go on to win 4 Olympia titles himself, later stated he thought Nasser should have won. Ronnie Coleman, the man who would dominate the sport for the next 8 years, expressed similar sentiments. Even Flex Wheeler, one of the most aesthetic bodybuilders ever, acknowledged that Nasser brought an incredible package that night. Then came the announcement. When the MC called Dorian Yates as the winner of his 6th consecutive Mr. Olympia title, the reaction was immediate and intense. Boos erupted from sections of the audience. Not polite disagreement, but genuine outrage. People were standing up, shouting, expressing their disbelief at what they'd just witnessed. Nasser, standing just feet away as the runner-up, maintained his composure on stage, but those who knew him could see the devastation behind his eyes. He brought everything he had. He'd done exactly what the sport demanded, and it still wasn't enough. The controversy exploded immediately after the show. Magazine forums, early internet bodybuilding communities, and gym conversations everywhere focused on one question: did Dorian really deserve to win? The arguments went back and forth endlessly. His supporters pointed to his superior chest, his championship pedigree, and the fact that he'd maintained enough conditioning despite the injury to justify the win. His detractors argued that bodybuilding should be about who brings the best physique on that specific night, not about rewarding past accomplishments or protecting the sport's chosen champion. The injury, they said, should have disqualified him from consideration, not earned him sympathy points. What made the situation even more suspicious to critics was the bigger picture. This was Dorian's last competition. Everyone knew he was retiring after 1997 regardless of the outcome. Giving him the win allowed the IFBB to send off their dominant champion with an unbroken winning streak and a fairy tale ending. Crowning Nasser, a man who'd publicly criticized the organization and failed a test just 1 year earlier, would have been a PR nightmare for the sport's power brokers. The timing was just too convenient. Dorian gets his 6th title, rides off into the sunset, and the organization can turn the page to a new era without the awkwardness of their injured champion losing in his final appearance. Nasser left that stage as the most dominant second-place finisher in Olympia history. But second place in bodybuilding doesn't come with the glory, the money, or the legacy that championship status provides. He'd been so close to achieving everything he'd worked for, only to have it snatched away by what he and many others perceived as political manipulation. The bitterness that had started with the 1996 disqualification now calcified into something harder and darker. In the years that followed, that bitterness would consume him in ways nobody could have anticipated. After 1997, Nasser El Sonbaty underwent a transformation that had nothing to do with muscle and everything to do with mindset. The man who'd once been known as the Professor for his intelligence and multilingual abilities became bodybuilding's most brutal truth-teller, or its most unhinged critic, depending on who you asked. He competed sporadically over the next few years, never quite recapturing the form he'd brought to that fateful Olympia. Each placing seemed to reinforce his belief that the sport was rigged against him. By the mid-2000s, he'd largely retired from competition, but that's when things really got interesting. Without the need to play politics or protect sponsorship deals, Nasser unleashed everything he'd been holding back. The interviews he gave between 2006 and 2010 were absolutely explosive. These weren't carefully crafted PR statements designed to maintain relationships in the industry. These were raw, unfiltered rants from a man who felt he'd been robbed and had nothing left to lose. He started calling out everyone. Judges who he claimed were corrupt and played favorites. Competitors who he said were protected by the organization regardless of how they looked on stage. Supplement company owners who he accused of manipulating the sport for profit. Even other legends weren't safe from his verbal attacks. Nobody was off limits, and Nasser didn't care about the bridges he was burning. One of his most infamous moments came during a 2008 interview where he systematically tore apart the credibility of multiple Mr. Olympia winners. He questioned how certain champions could look so different from year to year, implying pharmaceutical advantages that went beyond what everyone else was using. He talked about backstage deals and predetermined outcomes. He named names, called out specific competitions, and provided details that made people extremely uncomfortable. The bodybuilding establishment tried to dismiss him as a bitter has-been, but the problem was that too many of his accusations rang true to anyone who'd been paying attention to the sport's darker realities. His attacks on Flex Wheeler were particularly harsh. Despite Flex being considered one of the most genetically gifted bodybuilders ever, Nasser claimed he was overrated and protected by judges who preferred aesthetics over mass. He went after Kevin Levrone, suggesting his placings were inflated by politics rather than earned through superior physiques. Even Ronnie Coleman, who dominated the Olympia for 8 straight years after Dorian retired, didn't escape Nasser's criticism. He questioned whether Ronnie's later wins were as legitimate as his earlier ones, implying the judging had become even more corrupt as the years went on. These weren't subtle jabs or diplomatic disagreements. These were full-scale character assassinations delivered with the kind of intellectual precision that made them even more cutting. But Nasser saved his harshest words for the IFBB itself, and the weeder organization that controlled professional bodybuilding. He talked about how decisions were made in boardrooms rather than based on what happened on stage. He exposed the financial incentives that influenced which athletes got pushed and which ones got held back. He revealed conversations he'd had with other pros who privately agreed the sport was manipulated, but were too afraid to speak up publicly. Nasser positioned himself as the only one brave enough or crazy enough to tell the truth, consequences be damned. And the consequences were real. Magazine features dried up. Sponsorship opportunities vanished. His name became toxic in the industry. The online bodybuilding community had mixed reactions to Nasser's tirades. Some viewed him as a hero, finally saying what everyone else was thinking but too scared to vocalize. These fans saw him as the victim of a corrupt system who refused to shut up and accept his fate quietly. Others saw him as a bitter, delusional individual who couldn't accept that he simply wasn't good enough to win when it mattered most. They pointed out that plenty of other bodybuilders dealt with questionable judging decisions without turning into paranoid conspiracy theorists. The debates about whether Nasser was speaking truth to power or spiraling into obsessive bitterness became almost as intense as the original 1997 controversy. What was clear to everyone, though, was that Nasser wasn't doing well mentally or emotionally. His interviews became increasingly angry and rambling as the years progressed. He seemed unable to move past what had happened in 1997, constantly circling back to that night as the defining moment that proved everything wrong with bodybuilding. Friends and fellow competitors who tried to reach out found him difficult to connect with. The intellectual, charismatic person who'd once captivated audiences with his knowledge and personality had been replaced by someone consumed with grievances and resentment. The sport that had given him fame and opportunity had also broken something fundamental inside him. By 2010, Nasser had essentially become persona non grata in professional bodybuilding circles. The organizations he'd criticized wanted nothing to do with him. Former friends had distanced themselves to protect their own careers. Even fans who'd supported him through the controversies started wondering if he'd gone too far. But underneath all the anger and accusations, there was a legitimate point that Nasser kept trying to make. Bodybuilding had serious problems with subjective judging, political influence, and financial conflicts of interest. He just chose the most destructive possible way to communicate those problems. And as the 2010s began, his personal destruction was about to accelerate in ways that went far beyond career damage. The human body can only endure so much abuse before it starts shutting down. Decades of carrying over 300 pounds of muscle, the pharmaceutical protocols required to maintain that mass, the extreme dieting and dehydration cycles, the psychological stress of competition and controversy. All of it takes a toll that eventually comes due. For Nasser El Sonbaty, that bill arrived in late 2012, and the cost was devastating. In November of that year, Nasser was admitted to a hospital in San Diego, California. The initial symptoms had probably been building for months, maybe even years, but he'd ignored them the way athletes often do. By the time he sought medical attention, the damage was catastrophic. The diagnosis hit like a freight train. Heart failure. Kidney damage so severe that his organs were barely functioning. The doctors put him on dialysis immediately, trying to stabilize a system that was in complete collapse. This wasn't a temporary setback or something that could be fixed with treatment and rest. His kidneys were destroyed beyond repair, unable to filter toxins from his blood without mechanical assistance. The medical team delivered news that no one wants to hear. He wasn't a candidate for a transplant. Whether due to the extent of the damage, his medical history, or other complications, the option of receiving new kidneys wasn't available. He would need dialysis for whatever time he had left. Think about what that meant for someone like Nasser. This was a man who'd built his entire identity around physical supremacy. He'd spent decades crafting a physique that represented the absolute pinnacle of human muscular development. Now he was trapped in a failing body, hooked up to machines just to stay alive, watching the muscle waste away as his organs gave up. The psychological impact of that kind of decline, especially for someone already dealing with bitterness and resentment about how his career had ended, must have been unbearable. Friends who visited him during this period described a man who seemed defeated in a way competition losses had never managed to accomplish. After weeks in the San Diego hospital, Nasser made a decision. He wanted to go home to Egypt to see his family, to spend whatever time he had left in the place where his parents lived. The trip itself was risky given his medical condition, but Nasser was adamant. In early 2013, he traveled to Egypt, reconnecting with relatives who hadn't seen him in years. Those who spent time with him during those final months said he seemed more at peace than he'd been in a long time. The anger that had consumed him in his interviews had faded, replaced by a quiet acceptance of what was coming. He knew his time was running out. On March 20th, 2013, Nasser El Sonbaty passed away in his sleep. He was only 47 years old. The official cause was listed as heart and kidney failure, the same conditions that had hospitalized him months earlier. When news of his passing spread through the bodybuilding community, the response was immediate and complicated. Tributes poured in from competitors who'd stood on stage with him, fans who'd admired his physique, and industry figures who'd clashed with him over the years. But mixed in with the sadness was an uncomfortable recognition of what his story represented. Another mass monster gone too soon. Another cautionary tale about the price of extreme bodybuilding. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who'd followed his career. Nasser had spent years calling out the dark side of professional bodybuilding, the pharmaceutical abuse, the health risks nobody wanted to talk about publicly, the way the sport chewed up athletes and spit them out. He'd been right about most of it, but he'd also been a participant in that same system. He'd pushed his body to extremes that contributed to his early demise. The very qualities that made him a threat to Dorian Yates in 1997, the massive size and conditioning that required extreme measures to achieve, were the same factors that likely accelerated his organ failure. He'd warned about the dangers while simultaneously embodying them. Social media and bodybuilding forums exploded with discussions about Nasser's legacy in the days following his passing. Some focused on the 1997 controversy, arguing that he'd been robbed of an Olympia title he deserved, and that bitterness had poisoned the rest of his life. Others emphasized his intelligence, his linguistic abilities, and the way he'd stood out as a thinking person in a sport often criticized for anti-intellectualism. Many simply mourned the loss of one of the most genetically gifted bodybuilders ever, someone whose potential had never been fully realized due to politics, injuries, and ultimately health catastrophe. Dorian Yates, the man at the center of Nasser's greatest frustration, remained relatively quiet after the news broke. He posted a brief tribute acknowledging Nasser's abilities and expressing condolences, but he didn't engage with the renewed debates about 1997 or get drawn into arguments about who deserved what. At that point, Dorian had been retired for 15 years, had moved on to other business ventures and spiritual pursuits, and seemed to have made peace with his bodybuilding career in ways Nasser never managed to achieve. The contrast between their post-competitive lives couldn't have been starker. One man had found a way to move forward. The other had remained trapped in the past until it consumed him entirely. But Nasser's story didn't end with his passing. In the years since 2013, his reputation has undergone something of a rehabilitation. Younger fans discovering his physique through old footage and photographs are stunned by what he achieved. Many who watched the 1997 Olympia footage with fresh eyes come away believing he should have won. The criticisms he leveled at the sport's politics and corruption seem more valid with each passing year as more bodybuilders come forward with their own stories of questionable judging and organizational manipulation. In death, Nasser has become almost mythical, the uncrowned king whose potential was never fully recognized during his lifetime. So where does that leave us with the question that started this entire journey? Did Dorian Yates deserve to win the 1997 Mr. Olympia, or was Nasser El Sonbaty robbed of the only title that ever really mattered to him? The honest answer is that it depends entirely on what you believe bodybuilding judging should prioritize. If you think the best physique on that specific night should always win regardless of circumstances, then Nasser had a compelling case. His back was superior, his arms were symmetrical, and he wasn't dealing with a catastrophic injury that compromised his presentation. If you believe that championship pedigree, overall body structure, and the ability to compete through adversity should factor into close decisions, then Dorian's victory becomes more defensible. But here's what we know for certain. Both men paid an enormous price for their pursuit of muscular extremes. Dorian's body still bears the scars of his training intensity and competitive years, even though he got out before the damage became fatal. Nasser wasn't so fortunate. He pushed until his organs gave out, dying at an age when most people are just entering their peak earning years and enjoying the fruits of their earlier labor. The rivalry that defined both their careers ultimately mattered far less than the toll the sport extracted from their bodies and minds. One title or two titles, first place or second place, none of it changed the fundamental reality that professional bodybuilding in the mass monster era was unsustainable and dangerous.